Welcome to the Thrive Show, where we offer you practical advice that can be implemented into your daily spiritual lives to help you build a thriving home and a thriving sphere. Thanks for joining us.
Well, hey there, and welcome to this new episode of the Thrive Show. This is a part 2 on 2 ingredients to a better marriage, is what part 1 was. Today, we're going to be talking about 2 ingredients to better sex in marriage. Now, Sarah, why would we actually talk about this in such a public setting and put it out on YouTube and on podcasts? Why is it important that we talk about this?
I think that there's a lot of different perspectives that people bring to the table when they're talking about sex. What they've been taught growing up, what they've seen in or out of the home, and like what we see on a daily basis, either reading books or watching shows and movies. I think even though we know it's fiction or things that we're looking at, I think it still does affect our view on sex. Like you have when you've got couples who are dating on TV and it's saucy and hot and vibrant and they just can't help but want to have that
full
connection.
passion.
Yeah. And then you have the sitcom couple to where the husband is basically begging the wife and the wife is constantly saying no until the one time that she says yes. And then it's just like postured in a way where it's like, just get it over with. Like, okay, I'm finally going to concede. I'm finally going to say yes, but it's not going to be anything that I desire. And it's just going to be like, do what you need to get yours and then we can be done. And I think that a lot of times comes into our marriage into where we don't even realize it, but we sometimes have that influence the way that we approach sex. And so I think the world teaches us the message that when you're not married, do it and do it a lot. And it's awesome. And that's like the goal. And then when you are married, it's more of like this burden and this thing that you have to do, this duty thing that potentially is only one-sided as far as an enjoyment factor. Mm-hmm. And there's so much more just beauty to what that gift is, which that is what it is. It's a gift from God to couples in a marriage. And if it's viewed and presented in a way and like approached in a way that you view it as something that you get to do, not something that you have to do, that it's really something that can just deepen that level of intimacy that you have with your spouse. And it's really, in a lot of ways, it can be an act of worship even, the way that is experienced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it is an opportunity for us to enjoy a gift of the Lord. But it's not just like framed in unhealthy ways in the world, but it's also framed in unhealthy ways a lot of times in Christian resources, which may be surprising to hear, but here's a few of the like different kind of ways it's talked about in some of the most popular Christian marriage books. When they talk about sex, it's often framed in such a way where like sex is portrayed as merely a husband's need for physical release. That it's kind of postured in a way where it's all physical, and that the husband has this need that the wife doesn't. And that's the other thing, like a man wants sex, and then it's juxtaposed with the idea that a woman wants affection. So a man wants sex, a woman wants affection, and that's just something that both of the couples or both of the spouses need to understand. That he has needs that she doesn't, she has needs that he doesn't, and I believe that that's wrong. In fact, man and woman are human beings with the same needs for intimate oneness, and God gave us marriage as a vehicle for us to experience that with another human being. And that is just that those kind of postures, those kind of framing on what sex is just wrong. What we see taught in Scripture is this, that God created sex. It was his idea. And it's not a part of the curse. It was given before sin came in.
Yeah, like it wasn't like God was saying like, oh, well, now that you messed up, all right, man, you're going to have to like work hard and do all this. And woman, you're going to have pain and labor. Oh, and now you have to have sex. It's not like that. It was something that was gifted at the beginning.
Yeah, be fruitful and multiply. And it was like in the garden, Adam and Eve were naked, like for each other to see all of each other, right?
And that wasn't like a God facepalm moment. It wasn't like, oh, shoot, I forgot to create clothes.
Right. Yeah. And if anything, when Adam started to cover himself, God was like, what are you doing? Mm-hmm. So clothes are more of the effect of sin or one of the effects of sin than sex is. And so like we need to understand what sex is. And in the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 7, Paul says this about sex in marriage. He says this in verse 2, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 2, but because sexual immorality is so common, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife. He was talking about how, hey, it's good to be single, but then he says this, and each woman should have sexual relations with her own husband. So if that's a problem, like Paul says, it's good to be single. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. But for those of us who are married, this is what he says. A husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise a wife to her husband. A wife does not have the right over her own body, but her husband does. In the same way, a husband does not have the right over his own body, but his wife does. Do not deprive one another, except when you agree for a time to devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again. Otherwise, Satan may tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So like he's placing this in the context, is like he's writing to the church and saying, hey, if you're married, you should give yourself to your spouse, and your spouse should give themselves to you, and you should enjoy this mutual sexual life together. That it's good to do that act. It's good to be sexually intimate together. But the problem comes when a marriage is not firing on all cylinders, when emotional intimacy is not there. That affects physical intimacy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I've said it before, and again, I'm not like the originator with this statement, but emotional intimacy, communication being one of them, one of the aspects of that, is the thermostat of a marriage. The thermometer often can be the bedroom. And so if things aren't right there, it's probably not just simply the bedroom being the issue, but it's something else. And so in part one, we talked about what emotional intimacy is, and we introduced a matrix for it.
And if you haven't watched that, then it might be worthwhile to maybe just pause this one, go back, watch that one first, because that really kind of sets the foundation on what we're going to be talking about today.
But if you did, let's just review real quick on what that looks like. And here we are, the emotional intimacy matrix, which we reviewed in part one of this two-part series on the Thrive Show of a better marriage. And so like these are the two ingredients that we looked at for a better marriage: high communication, high care. If those two things are there, then it will lead to good things. But a lot of times we don't often, feel like we're at peak communication and peak care where we're way up here. A lot of couples struggle in one or both of these areas. And so we looked at, okay, what does it look like to be in a relationship where there's low communication, low care? It oftentimes results and manifests itself in stonewalling, giving up, feeling numb. And then this is oftentimes the spot where couples are worried about divorce, because there doesn't seem to be a lot of warmth. There doesn't seem to be a lot of communication, and it just is not a good recipe for a healthy marriage. And so then we turned and say, okay, what does it look like to have high communication, low care? Well, this oftentimes looks like fighting, dying on too many hills, selfishness, nitpicking. It's just, there's a lot of communication, but it's not in any way caring. And then we moved on down here.
Yeah, so like where you have more of the lower communication, higher care, and that's kind of like where you find that false peace. It's where you think that you're maintaining that peaceful home to where you're not rocking the boats, you're not really fighting because you're probably avoiding certain topics. You're not really sharing your needs or desires because you kind of feel like it's selfish to do so, or maybe it's triggering to do so. And so you kind of have that martyr syndrome. And we kind of also wrap this up to, there's a lot of fear that drives this. Fear to upset the other, fear to be vulnerable. And it's just like, that's when you have that high care, but you don't really communicate about those things. But then when you jump up here, that's where you still have that high care, but then you also are communicating a lot more. You have that high communication. And that's where the trust and intimacy is really founded. Like that is where it gets stronger. You can, when you have the trust and intimacy, you have so much more fun because you're allowing yourself to be just fully you. You're enjoying life. You're having better sex life because you're trusting the other person. You have that emotional intimacy. And so it just naturally leads to that physical intimacy. Fortitude, you guys can withstand, and you're kind of brought stronger together over time. And then you're just best friends. Like you fully get one another. You trust one another. You are your complete vulnerable self and honest person with your spouse, and you just have more fun. And so we're going to basically use this as the foundation and moving on into the physical intimacy side. So like, as we talked about, this can lead to a better sex life. And so we want to kind of use this same idea with the communication and care, but talking about how we can maintain and find that physical intimacy part of the marriage.
Yep, because it's the same 2 ingredients, but it's applied in a different way. And so we'll look at that today. So physical intimacy. The physical intimacy matrix looks very similar at this point, at this stage, as the emotional intimacy matrix, and that's for good reason, because it all is connected. Our relationships are like we are as human beings. We are holistic. And so if something's not right with communication levels, care levels, then it's gonna be impacted when you come together in that intimate way.
Yeah, and I think ultimately the goal is to have a better sex life, but there are probably 3, I would say, general obstacles that you probably have that would make it to where you may not find yourself in this upper right quadrant. And that would be a lack of trust, to where obviously, when we talked about before with that high communication, high care, it builds trust. So if you're not there, you have a little bit of a disconnect on how you're trusting the spouse. And that automatically will mean you're not going to trust what happens in the bedroom, because there's just this disconnect and you're not feeling as close and that you can connect on that level. I would say insecurity in that, which can manifest in a lot of different ways. I mean, whether it's just insecurity about your body or about being vulnerable, or maybe just things at work or things that happened in your past, and kind of bringing that into the marriage and then using that as a filter in how you approach sex. And then I would say the last thing, probably more of a general obstacle, would be just ignorance. Either ignorance about your spouse, I don't know what you like, or I don't know what you don't like. I don't know really where you're coming from. Maybe you don't know your spouse's past. What are they bringing to the table? And then also just ignorance on the topic of sex. I think just like you were talking about at the beginning of this episode, where there's just a lot of media, either, mainstream or even Christian, articles and books and things that are teaching us something that really is more of an ignorant view on sex. It's not really the way that God designed it, or even what's biblical. If you take it actually what God wrote, things taken out of context. And so when you have all those things that you bring into the marriage, I think that just creates obstacles to maintain and to actually get to the place of better sex.
Yeah, because again, both man and woman desire intimacy. So it's not that the man just wants sex and the woman just wants affection. That's false. Both want both. And really, at the end of the day, the foundation of that is intimacy. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of break this down in the same way, but applied to sex, and see what that ends up looking like. And this is going to be a helpful diagnostic tool to ask yourself and ask your spouse, okay, where do you see us in this? And then the empowering thing about this is when you can identify where you are, you can identify what you need to grow in. And if you identify what you can grow in, then you're going to be able to grow in that. And you can. And you just have to believe that and then do the work necessary to do it. And we're going to give you some questions that you and your spouse can discuss together at the end, to kind of diagnose and then work on, okay, where can we make some improvements here? And again, it may go back, and it likely will go back to the emotional intimacy piece. So, okay, let's break this down. Low communication, low care. Sarah, what does that look like in relation to sex life?
Okay, well, just like with the emotional intimacy, that's where basically you kind of have grown numb. And so I would say the transition into the physical intimacy side is you also, there's the desire, your libido is just gone. There is no more drive, and that can be derived maybe because of just the attempts, and then eventually you just give up, or eventually maybe the experience together has been not an ideal one. And so eventually you just kind of you lose that desire over time. This could be where you have almost a holiday schedule where it's anniversary and Valentine's Day or something like that, a very, very few and far between when you actually are coming together in an intimate way. And then, or just no sex at all. To where you're basically just roommates living in the same house and not much closeness and connection, especially physically, is happening. And I just want to preface too, when we're going through these quadrants, some of the topics that we're not necessarily addressing in this episode is we're not addressing past trauma or abuse, and how that obviously will play a part into your sex life and just you as a person, a holistic person. We're not really talking about if you have physical conditions or things that make it hard to actually engage in that kind of an act. And so if any of those are things that relate to you, like just know that we're not ignoring it or anything, but we're not using those things. Like that would be something where you definitely seek either professional help to work through some of those things or, to get help and all that. But that's not something that we're going to be focusing on today.
Okay. So we got low communication, low care. It's just oftentimes a sexless marriage, or very infrequent. So what though happens when a marriage is high communication, but low care? How does that end up translating to the bedroom?
I would say like if sex is a triggering topic, whether it's because of what you've experienced in your past and what you're bringing to the table, and let's say it's a filter in which you're viewing it, and so like it can be almost weaponized. Okay. I would say kind of like the sitcom analogy that we were talking about, where like the husband is begging and the wife finally concedes and says fine, but like maybe it's used in a way of like, well, no, like okay, or let me say it this way. Like if you're wanting your spouse to do something and you're almost using it as like a manipulative or bribing sort of a way, it's like, okay, fine. If you do this, then we can have sex tonight. Like using that as a means to my ends outside of the bedroom and using it as just a bartering tool.
Yeah. And that leads to the next one, which is like selfish sex, which is also a part of that as well.
Yeah, it's just definitely one-sided, and you're only thinking about yourself. You're not really thinking about what your spouse would like. Or let's say, in that scenario, like the husband finally is able to, and so he's just fucking like, this is my time where I can finally do this. And so I'm just going to get mine, get out, and be done.
And also there's like a lot of anxiety with that. It's like, oh no, like, and also there's not a lot of like communicated desire.
Yeah.
Not feeling desired by your spouse.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing that you'll find in this area too is a lot of complaints in sex. And what I mean by that is, let's say that you guys in a marriage, they do actually have sex, but then one of the spouse is complaining like, I don't like this, or you're not very good at this, or you should do this more, or, so-and-so in my past did this. Why can't you, fill in the blank? And I've heard stories like that, and it's heartbreaking because then you're basically telling your spouse you're not good enough and you're not meeting a certain expectation that I have of you that may or may not be realistic and may not be fair, especially if there's a comparison coming into the play. And all you're going to be doing is beating your spouse down verbally and making it to where they don't feel secure. They don't feel like they can trust you, and they won't want to participate in that because they're not being accepted and loved for who they are and how they are in the bedroom.
Because sex is a vulnerable thing to do. Like it's very vulnerable. And if there's not care involved in that, then it's going to lead to painful sex because each spouse is not going to be open for that to be shared. Like it's got a lot of impacts and effects that can be a part of it. Okay, so high care, low communication. How does that manifest?
It's basically, I would say, where you get the duty sex.
Okay.
Like it can probably fall in a couple of different quadrants, but I would say this is probably the most prevalent because this is where your spouse wants it, you may not be, or your spouse wants to do something that you may not want, and you care, you want to meet that desire, but let's say it's not something that you enjoy or something you're comfortable with, or maybe you're just not in the mood at that time, or you have whatever the case may be, but you feel obligated to do it. And because you don't want to be offensive or you don't want to make them feel bad, that's just where that duty comes in. You made a comment about like not really expressing your desires. Here it may be because you're getting attacked for doing so, or you feel like the focus is too much on the other spouse to do that. Here it might be the same. You're not expressing the desires because you just don't feel like you can, or you feel like it's too selfish to do so. And so again, you're kind of limiting the experience that you can have because you won't be able to fulfill the desires that you even have.
Yeah. Here it's like, I don't feel desired by my spouse. It's just like, oh, this is just for you. Right. This is just for you. And yeah, so like it can also be, if it's selfish, then the spouse who isn't being the selfish one can feel like, oh, I'm just an object for your pleasure. But if it's like yeah, I guess I'll throw you a bone every now and again, then it's like, well, I don't feel desired. And when that's not, especially for guys, and I'd say it for women as well, like for both spouses, if neither one of them feel desired by the other, that's going to impact things greatly. And then down here, duty sex, it's obligatory. But then, whereas here it could be like not feeling desired, here it's, well, I'm not expressing my desires. And maybe it's because you don't feel like you can, because it's not really a subject that is on the table to talk about, because it's low communication. So all these things kind of play, they interact with each other from the emotional intimacy side to the physical intimacy side. And you can see the overlap here. But okay, what does it look like then for high communication, high care? Again, with all of the other caveats that we've already made, what does that end up looking like in the bedroom?
I mean, definitely just a healthy sex life. That is where you are both desires are being met. You are both being selfless in the sense of trying to make sure there's a mutual satisfaction, a mutual enjoyable experience. I think you have fun. Like, it's like sex doesn't have to be this boring or serious time together. Like, it's a time where you can be silly, you can laugh, especially as you get older and you get Charlie horses and cramps, as you're moving around, like you can laugh about it. It's okay. And it just makes it more enjoyable and fun, taking yourself less serious. It's like where you have trust in the bedroom to where, let's say there's something that you've never really expressed before. Well, then you feel like you actually can be vulnerable and express that to your spouse. And I don't know. I think things are more natural. It's not as forced. It's not as scary, or it's not as, I don't know, it wouldn't be looked as burdensome as rather than, hey, this is something that we get to do together.
Right. It is an act of knowing each other. It is a mutual activity. Both are engaged. And yes, there's going to be times in any marriage that is healthy, that the healthiest of marriages, there are going to be times where the libidos is going to be different and the desires are going to be different. And that's okay. But when you have the emotional intimacy that is built on the foundation of communication and care, then that means we approach those things we talk about it, we care about the other person, so we want to hear what their situation is or whatever. And over time, bodies change. And so you navigate all those things. But if you don't have this already built up with high communication, high care, then it's going to make those changes be even harder and more difficult. It's just not going to be as set up for success as opposed to if you did have that.
Well, and I think what you talked about, all the things that are going on, especially in this situation, if a libido changes or something, let's say one spouse, it's dropped, for whatever the reason may be, and the other hasn't, communicating that, just saying hey, this is what I've been experiencing. Or on the other, hey, I've noticed that this hasn't been as much of a topic of conversation, or it seems to be a desire. So by communicating that in a caring sort of way, not coming over why hasn't this been happening, or whatever.
Because it's well, I'm not getting what I want, so what in the world is going on?
So you eliminate the possibility of filling in the gap. So then you're not feeling oh, maybe he or she doesn't desire me anymore. Or maybe I'm not attractive anymore. And then you start kind of either self-shaming or having those insecurities rise up versus just communicating hey, what's been going on? Can you tell me a little bit? Having that, because then it shows that, hey, I care about you. I trust you. And I want to know what's going on. So that way, is there a way that I can love you in a way that is what you need in this season? And it's not so much of it's all one-sided. It's just hey, we are having a disconnect, which is okay. Seasons of life, they change, and it's not always going to be a flat line. And so what can we do? Because we need to be able to ebb and flow together and love on each other in the season that we're in.
And then the other person gets to say, oh, well, yeah, I guess I have been feeling this way or been dealing with this, you're right, versus getting defensive and well, why are you, well, you're not doing, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, to kind of bring all this together, to kind of contrast those three barriers that you gave earlier, which were a lack of trust, insecurity, and ignorance, I believe that there are 3 keys to good sex, and that would be to communicate openly. So we have got the communication, to embrace vulnerability. So that is, to me, a combination of communication and care, and it's really the result of trust, and to practice mutual self-giving. And that leads to mutual satisfaction. So knowing that, okay, I'm not the only person involved in this. We are a couple who is brought together by the grace and the gift of the Lord in marriage, and we are one. And so I want to care for the other, just like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, like we looked at, to fulfill the wife's sexual desires, to the marital duty, as he puts it, and vice versa. So to kind of bring this back to you and to make this real practical, we've got some questions that we would just want to offer to you that you can then hopefully go to your spouse and hopefully you both watch this either together or at separate times, and you can come together for a conversation. Because sometimes sex is one of those topics that, while it might be engaged in, it oftentimes doesn't get talked about. And if we accomplish one goal today, it's to get you and your spouse to have a conversation, and that to be approached with care and communication. Now, I will say this. If you find yourself here on the emotional intimacy level and on the physical intimacy level, then there's going to be there's a need to do some work before you think that, like, oh, well, let's just have sex more often. That's going to fix it. No. That's not going to fix it. That could do more harm. So a healthy marriage leads to a healthy sex life, and a healthy sex life can enhance a healthy marriage. But if there's things that are very much wrong, then you need to address those things first. Because remember, this is the thermometer, it's not the thermostat. So with that caveat, we've got some questions that we want to just offer to you to consider conversing with your spouse about.
Yeah, so like as we've been talking through this, just the first obvious one is, where do you see yourself? Like you and your spouse, where would you place yourself on this matrix? Like, do you find yourself here, like where Brandon was talking about? Do you feel like you're a little bit more here, where it's never really been so much of a desire as much as it kind of just feels I have to. It's my responsibility. I'm supposed to do this.
And you don't need to feel shame about that. You need to just be honest.
Yeah, I think that's like step one is definitely be honest with yourself, because if you know and you can articulate where you're at, then you know where you can go. Like you actually have direction versus if you just are in denial, then you kind of stay in that barrier of ignorance. And so then you kind of like, I don't like where we're at, but I don't know what to do with it. So like, be honest with yourself. It's okay.
And it comes from a place. So, identify, okay, be honest with where you are.
Mm-hmm. Or here, like, is it something to where you feel like you're a tool, or you feel like you almost have maybe an unhealthy view of sex, whether it's because of what you're bringing to the table in your past and the way that you're looking at your spouse to fulfill something that either has become an idol or become like an insecurity, or just something that you're bringing to that's not a healthy, loving, caring view of sex. Or on the other side, you feel like you are the one being used for your spouse's gain. Or here, like you feel like, you know what, I'm actually pretty happy. Like I feel like we have a good, loving, intimate connection, and we feel like there's trust and communication, and we both are having an equal amount of enjoyment and fulfillment in the bedroom.
So where do you feel like you and your spouse are? And just be honest about it.
And then I think the next thing is, do you know what your spouse likes? I think like in a physical intimacy way, and that can be, and I don't know if we actually address this or not, but like physical intimacy is not just sex. Intimacy is not just yes. And so like physical intimacy, that is any type of physical love and connection that you're having, whether that's all the way from holding hands and hugging all the way to the actual intercourse and
to foreplay, to intercourse, all that.
Yeah. And so all that. When we say that, like, do you know what your spouse likes? Do they like physical touch? Do they not? Do they like it when you do this versus that and all that? And so if you don't, take some time and ask them, in a caring sort of way, not in a, well, what do you like? Show them like, I actually care and I want to know. And so by finding that out, you can be like, I never knew that you liked that. And then it's like, oh, I can totally do that more, or I can stop doing that if it's something you don't like.
And then the contrast side, or like the other side of that, is, does your spouse know what you like?
Yeah.
Have you communicated that in a caring, loving way? And have you actually voiced what you like?
Yeah. And if not, then we would recommend to do so. You know, take that time to be vulnerable and talk about it. And it's okay to do it. The next question I would say is, how do you view sex? And that can be like, what have you been taught? And really spend some time and really think about that, because I think sometimes we don't really think about why we believe what we believe or why we view things the way that we do. And so think about, like, what has been my journey up until this point? What has been my experiences up until this point? What has shaped the way I have viewed sex up until this point? And then either come to terms with that and work through that, or express that and tell your spouse, be like, hey, this is how I've been framing it, or something. And that way you can either be freed from some big things that have been holding you back for many years that you may not even been realizing, or it's something to where you can just let your spouse know, like, hey, this is where I'm coming from. And maybe if that's something you've never shared, that can also be a moment of connection with your spouse, because then they can actually have compassion and understanding about where you're coming from.
Yeah, one of the pastors I follow, his name is Steve Cuss, and he talks a lot about emotional health and a lot of those things. And one of the things he says about anxieties or insecurities or anything kind of like that, he says, once you name it, you tame it. So voice, put to words, language, what you believe. And you don't have to like worry about, oh, is this wrong or right? It's just, okay, what is right now? And then you can start to, once you get honest with yourself about that, then you can start to combat that if it is a lie with the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, because I think that there's a difference between viewing sex as a knowing and an owing, and that's kind of like where this comes into. Mm-hmm. So like, do you find yourself falling into one of those camps? And if so,
say that again though.
There's a difference with sex, with viewing sex as a knowing experience, something where you are knowing your spouse, and it's an engaging and
intimate oneness.
Yes.
Oh, knowing.
Versus owing, like, check, I did it, or we have to, or there's a certain strict schedule that we need to follow, or, you know, like it's my role that I have to do this, therefore, like, just viewing it as that rather than an experience together. And then I would say lastly, kind of like what we had talked about, like, how much does your past influence your sex life with your spouse? What filter are you viewing sex through, and is it fair? Is it something to where you're putting something that your spouse had nothing to do with onto them, and that is how you're navigating that encounter? Or is that something to where you haven't actually worked through some of the things, and so you're using that as a barrier between you and your spouse, when again, it's not merited? And so like working through those things, how much has that influenced your sex life, and is it impacting your sex life and impacting your spouse? Yeah.
So all this, again, tools so that you and your spouse can have a conversation about sex. And so if you're like, okay, well, we usually don't talk about this subject. All right, well, then just send your spouse a text, give them a call, say, hey, can we talk about sex? And then just make sure you guys watch this video together first. And again, remember, emotional intimacy leads to physical intimacy. So if you need one more, it's emotional intimacy, and it should flow to physical intimacy. So hope and pray that this has been helpful to you and your spouse. If it has, feel free to leave a comment if you're on YouTube. If you're on podcast, don't forget to leave a rating and review on that platform for The Thrive Show, so more and more people, both in our community and abroad, can benefit from The Thrive Show. So glad that you joined us. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Thrive Show. Our vision at the First Church of Christ is to build thriving homes and thriving spheres, and that can only happen with a thriving relationship with our God. Now, if you want a fun and interactive way to get your household thriving in all those areas, you're definitely going to want to check out this new game that we've created. It's called the Thrive Deck, and it's available now. To play the game, simply draw a card from the deck once a week and do whatever the challenge says. If the challenge doesn't apply to your household, do the option instead. And if the challenge isn't quite challenging enough, then you have a bonus option you could do as well. Each card has a designated challenge based on one of 3 different categories. One focuses on your home, These challenges are designed to help you thrive in your household, whether you live alone or with a spouse or with children. Another category emphasizes your relationship with God by offering new ways to encourage growth in your personal spiritual life. The last category prioritizes your relationships within your personal spheres of influence. These cards might challenge you to step out of your comfort zone with friends, coworkers, or acquaintances and help you all thrive in your relationship with God. So are you up for the challenge? Visit the FCC Welcome Center to purchase yours and keep thriving in your homes and in your spheres.